from prehistory to ancient history to modern history, from missing aircraft to ghost ships, from extinct animals to murders that occurred thousands of years ago, to searches for lost family fortunes to fugitives who escaped. There are many, many, many unsolved and very obscure mysteries from throughout history, and throughout prehistory too, that most people have simply not heard about. In this video, volume 3 of a series, we will cover 9 more very obscure mysteries that remain unsolved. These case files are going to vary rather widely from one another in a lot of cases, but all share the overall theme of being mostly obscure topics that most people don't know about. And obscure historical mystery, as I'm using it here, is also kinda a catch-all term for any topic that interests me that is not widely known, but is either unsolved or disputed. So without further ado, let's get to the first one. A prehistoric mystery to start off, the dubious dinosaur, Tatankaceratops, which might not even have existed in the first place. Yep, settle in, Spino, because you're going to have an existential crisis on this one, for a dinosaur that is even more of a roller coaster than all the Spinosaurus drama from the last few years. This dinosaur lived in the Great Cretaceous, in the Maastrichtian age specifically, in modern-day South Dakota. Its name means bison horn face, and it was a member of the ceratopsian group of dinosaurs, whose members include the very famous Triceratops. If it existed, this one wouldn't have been a direct relative of Triceratops, but rather a relative to an ancestor of Triceratops that it branched off from, but the two lived at the same time, assuming this one existed. Oh, okay, Spino, I will. Living around 66 million years ago, the dinosaur genus is known only from a single partial skull fossil found in the Hell Creek Formation that was dated to be 66 million years old, the tail end of the Cretaceous itself. This dinosaur had the characteristics of being an odd hybrid almost, figuratively, not literally. It had the characteristics of an adult and a juvenile Triceratops. However, the way the skull was hybridized, again figuratively, is where it's weird. The dinosaur's skull had the signs that you see in an old individual, such as gnarled bones and fusion in the skull, but it also likewise had these slender brow horns and the small nose that you see in juvenile Triceratops. Some theories about this animal try to explain this, and oftentimes the result tends to be that it is not a valid genus that ever existed. Some argue otherwise as well, so the status on if this dinosaur existed as we understand it is debated. Some theories about it include that the fossilized bones represent a dwarf species of Triceratops, which that would be cool, or that the animal is just a juvenile Triceratops species. Some paleontologists strongly suspect this. Subsequent studies do tend to lean towards the conclusion that the dinosaur genus never actually existed, and that the fossils we have were merely misidentified. Now, a friend of mine who is a bit more versed into the technicalities of paleo study of dinosaurs had some good comments about this when we talked about it, so I'm going to share what he thought. It honestly looks like this one is basically not a genus. This one isn't totally cut and dry, but it doesn't leave much room when it's been treated as a juvenile Triceratops for more than a decade. It's just another Nanotyrannus situation. Ontogeny is hard with fossils, and not everyone looks to ontogeny when describing new finds right away. You really have to know juvenile animals well, something tough when crocodiles and birds have dramatically different ontogenies. So for now, this obscure, unsolved topic sits on the shelf of we don't know. We don't know if Tatankaceratops as a genus actually existed, or if the fossil is merely a misidentified juvenile Triceratops. Given that the secret has been buried for 66 million years, the answer might take another 66 for it to be dug up again. In 1922, a man who had been born into poverty, but had risen above it to a higher class, and was descended from a very wealthy family line consisting of landowners and soldiers, and one of his ancestors even saved an important viceroy from assassination in 1800, disappeared without a trace, and to this day, 101 years later, he has never been found, nor has any trace of him ever been found. Alejandro Nicolas Saavedra was born on April 2nd, 1901, in Buenos Aires in the San Telmo neighborhood. His parents, Juan and Elena were living in a high-class area at the time of Alejandro's birth, but the long family fortune had essentially completely dried up, and they might very well have been masquerading as if they were still wealthy. If they kept it a facade at all, that is. Alejandro was poor during his childhood. His father just worked as a teacher at a secondary school, and his mother was a seamstress. However, the parents made sure that they gave their son the best upbringing they could in the circumstances. Alejandro's father made sure that he got a good education, and his mother was a gifted storyteller who told long tales of the family history and legacy of the line that he had been born into. Beginning in 1919, Alejandro began to attend classes at the University of Buenos Aires. While here, his love and appreciation for poetry really came out, and he joined a poetry group in the university. In this group, he even met someone who was the grandson of an individual who had fought in the Battle of Pavon in 1861, which Alejandro's grandfather had also fought in. He also learned from this group that there was a chance a letter his great-grandfather had written might be in an archive somewhere. And that was significant because it was, if found, it would give the family a lot of land. Alejandro searched in multiple archives for this letter, but the only record of his great-grandfather that he ended up finding was not a letter, but instead a paper listing that he was on a supply ship called the San Nicola, which had actually disappeared back in 1807 on the way to another city 600 miles to the north. His great-grandfather was later found to be one of the only survivors who were ever located. He never did find the letter that his great-grandfather supposedly left behind that would give his descendants much stability in land and wealth. If that ever even existed at all is another mystery, but not the topic of this story. So that brings us up to September of 1922. In the weeks leading up to this, after his visits to libraries and archives were turning up nothing, his friends noted that he stopped attending the artist meetings, and he was almost always seen in an elevated state of agitation or excitement. It is thought that these lines he wrote actually serve as a peek into his mind at the time. Fortune wrapped in shining lies, too much for you to spend. Truth rests under unmarked graves. How much was buried with it? Finally, on September 22nd, 1922, Alejandro vanished. He left no note about where he was going and burned most of his journals. There were possible sightings of him in 1933 and 1941, and it's also theorized that an unidentified body found a year after he vanished was in fact his. Ultimately, though, no one knows what happened to Alejandro, why he vanished, where he went, or when he died. Or if he vanished of his own accord, and if he did so, then why? And perhaps someone had even intentionally hidden away the letter, assuming it did exist, and decided that he was getting too close to finding it, so maybe they made him vanish. All of these are unanswered questions. We have absolutely nothing to go on at all. 101 years later, and there are still no answers in this case, and that is unlikely to ever change. Alejandro was also a writer of poetry, and in his lifetime he produced one written work of poetry. Febrero Enero, meaning February, January, and the short story, The Unfortunate Son, was also published 5 years after he vanished, but if that one was actually written by him is also unknown. This Danish-British-built five-masted bark saw use as a Navy vessel for the training of youth cadets, and she was the largest sailing vessel in the world. Her 5 masts made her easily recognizable and would be a key part to this story. The Copenhagen was built from 1913 to 1921 and weighed almost 4,000 gross registered tons. From 1921 to 1928, she made 9 commercial voyages, 2 circumnavigations of the globe, and visited nearly all the continents. Her maiden voyage was, in fact, a grand one. She circumnavigated the globe on that first trip, doing it in just over a year, starting in September 1921 and ending in November of the next year. Ironically, she was actually en route to Buenos Aires, of all places, on what ultimately became her final voyage. On this trip, her captain was Hans Andersen, and there were a grand total of 75 people on board. They were carrying a cargo of chalk and bagged cement, which was bound for Buenos Aires. And they were, in turn, going to pick up another cargo there and take it to Melbourne. And there they would pick up a third cargo, which they would take back to Europe. She made it safely to Buenos Aires on November 17th, 1928, and her scale was impressive to the locals. Her cargo was unloaded, and she finally left again on December 14th, sailing for Australia with no cargo. She was due to arrive in 45 days. 8 days after she left port, she exchanged radio messages with a Norwegian steamer called the William Blummer, and according to her, she was 900 miles from a remote set of volcanic islands in the southern Atlantic Ocean. She said all was well. And then she was never heard from again. The Blummer attempted to contact the ship again only a few hours after their first communication, but there was no response. So whatever happened in just a few hours of time, and what had happened resulted in the crew having no time to call for help. That's what's weird here. This isn't like the Waratah, which didn't have a radio. This ship did, so why was there no call for help? Why did she drop out of contact as if the whole crew had just vanished into thin air? A search set out for the ship right away when contact was lost. Thank goodness, because I've read too many stories now where everyone just assumed things were fine and did nothing for days, weeks, or even months before they even started to assume something was wrong. But in this case, despite setting out right away to look for the ship, nothing was found. The Copenhagen was just gone. Her captain was known for having periods of long radio silence, but after months, people knew something was wrong, especially since the trip was only supposed to take 45 days. A ship called the Mexico was sent to that remote set of islands that the ship had radioed about, and the locals there reported that on January 21st, 1929, they had seen a ship drift past that seemed to be abandoned. And what was it about this ghost ship that people saw that was significant to the mystery of the Copenhagen? All of the descriptions of the derelict ship shared one key detail. They all said the ship they saw had 5 masts. The foremast was apparently broken, but she had 5. The Mexico searched for 7 months along with the Royal Navy, but no trace of the ship was ever found. The Copenhagen might have kept sailing for a time after that last sighting if it was indeed her, but for how long and where she ended up is a mystery. And if that was her sailing by, that is even stranger, because that means she didn't sink. So why did the crew not call for help when whatever calamity occurred? Theories to explain this ship's loss, she was officially declared lost after 7 months, include the ship striking an iceberg, but again, why wouldn't they call for help? Even in a rapid sinking, there should have been time to send something, anything, even just, a guess on the position. Even that's wrong. A call for help to the general area is better than nothing. But if the ship the locals had seen on the island was her, then she did not sink and she kept sailing. But then there's also the question of, aside from ignoring the fact there was no call for help, if that was the Copenhagen drifting by, what happened to the crew? It's eerie when people just vanish, but the ship is still there. More so, even, in a situation where there's a radio on board. There were also several possible sightings of the ship floating in the ocean for the next several years, further supporting the idea that she did not sink. In 1930, the crew of an Argentine freighter saw a 5-masted ship floating by in a gale, which that's kind of creepy. Other sightings also reported her off the coast of Peru. A piece of wreckage with the ship's name also was reportedly found in Western Australia. There is also another aspect of this mystery that ties into another location we covered in this series, Bouvet Island. Again, of all places, I can't believe that one's getting brought up again in another mystery. Supposedly, in 1934, a message in a bottle washed up there from the Copenhagen, and it was found on Bouvet Island. The messages were actually a cadet's diary, and it claimed that the ship had been destroyed by many icebergs and she was being abandoned, with her crew taking their chances in the boats. But again, why no message on the radio? Also, in 1935, the remains of a lifeboat complete with a human skeleton were found along the southwest coastline of Africa. These might have been from the Copenhagen. Where the ship ultimately came to rest, be it on the shores of some island or at the bottom of the ocean or the coastline of some country, is a total mystery. The wreck has never been found and likely would be found only by random chance if it ever was. That is only a hopeful notion, though. The answer to this mystery will likely never be known. First off, I am going to show the picture of one of these bodies, and it is something people might find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised, but as I feel this is important for the science and the history, I think it is good to show it. Also, this is purely for an educational purpose, but if you don't want to see it, skip to the next section. The video is in chapters, and it is easy to go right to the next section if you don't want to. I understand if you don't, and I'll see you there. Right, here we go. Last chance to skip if you don't want to see. So this is one of the 6 Gabbling pre-dynastic mummies. The 6 are naturally mummified bodies that all date to right around 3400 BC from ancient Egypt. The bodies were buried in shallow graves in the fetal positions, common in Egyptian burial from the time. 2 were male, 1 was female, and the others are all unknown. With the bodies were jars. The decorated jars were placed next to the mummies themselves. Gabbling Man was one of the 6 mummies, and in November 2012, a study of him revealed that he had in fact been murdered. His murder and why it occurred are complete, unsolved mysteries, but from a CAT scan we have found undisputable puncture wounds on the body. The murder weapon itself was used with high force to the point that his shoulder blade was actually damaged. It also shattered a bit beneath and punctured a lung, all from one blow. The weapon itself was likely a copper blade or a flint knife of some kind. The current theory is that he was jumped in a surprise attack, so maybe a robbery, or maybe it was a personally motivated killing. For all we know, the killer also got away with it, or maybe even the killers. This case is the definition of an obscure historical mystery. This is not one that a lot of people seem to know about, and there is no way to solve it. We have no idea who this guy was. We have no idea who murdered him, what their motive was, if they knew him or not, if it was just random. And because of all those unknowns, this is also just a case where there's just not a lot of information. As I said, we have no idea who this man was, who killed him, why, or if they were ever caught. Why this man was murdered and by whom is a secret long lost to time, and one that will never be answered. Now, the topic of these mummies as a whole is a fascinating topic that could and possibly will get its own video in the future, so consider this a teaser for it because these are fascinating. Another murder that has never been solved, this time from 1682, and in this case, there are suspects, but no one was ever identified as the killer. So Antonio Stradella was a freelance composer who was born in 1643. He was known for writing commissions, working with distinguished poets and collaborations, and he produced over 300 works in his lifetime, covering many genres. A lot of the details of his early life have been either shakily recorded or just outright lost to time, but we know a few details such as his father's name and that he received education in Rome. By age 24, he was already becoming known as a composer, and in 1667, he composed a new, now lost, Latin oratorio. In the early 1670s, he collaborated in writing operas at the Tordinoa Theatre. For these, he composed things like the prologues. He also composed operas around this time for aristocratic families that were performed in private theaters. Y'all probably don't really care about any of that, though. You're here for the mystery of the story, so let's get right to it. About a decade after he composed those works we were talking about, in 1682, he was stabbed to death while walking home with a servant of his who had his hands full of cake. He died at the scene before he could even speak. What we know, as I said suspects exist, is that a member of a wealthy family hired someone to kill Stradella, but who the killer was has never been solved. Despite his murder never being found, there are theories. One report from the time of his murder even states, Stradella was murdered by 3 brothers whose sister he had seduced, but if this is true is unknown, and Stradella himself is buried at a Roman Catholic Basilica church in Genoa, Italy, that was built in the 10th century. And we are no closer to finding out who the killer was than they were 300 years ago, and this one remains one of those many unsolved mysteries that we are left with nothing to go on and don't have a lot of information to go over either, and it's unlikely to ever change either. Let's revisit much more recent history for the next couple. The Douglas C-47 Skytrain was a military transport aircraft developed from the Douglas DC-3 airliner, and it was extensively used in World War II, the first flight of one occurring in December 1941. The specific plane we are looking at in this unsolved mystery crashed into the ocean in 1945 and left a chilling final message before all contact was lost. The story of this specific Douglas C-47B plane started when it was assigned to the Royal Australian Air Force in March 1945, assigned to 35 Squadron, designated as an RAAF ambulance aircraft A6583 with its call sign being VHCIZ. On December 18, 1945, the aircraft was en route to Darwin, the capital city of the North Territory of Australia, being piloted by Officer Francis Robinson. It left the island of Ambon at 10:40 a.m. that morning, and an hour later it requested to place a message. Darwin Airfield gave the plane the go-ahead to send it, but there was no response. The next day, on December 19th, 1945, the plane was near the island of Timor over the Banda Sea, flying through a storm. A message was sent from the plane saying its passengers and crew, total of 26 people, were, quote, alive, all alive, waiting to be picked up. Second message was also sent, but it was too garbled to make anything out other than the VHCIZ call sign. 2 days later, there was one more message a civilian engineer picked up that simply said, Darwin from Timor, waiting to be picked up. And that was it. No wreckage was ever found, and no trace of the plane or the people have ever been found. The Australian Defence Force refused to investigate the case, so stick it to those who might have been stranded somewhere, I guess. This is weird. This sounds like, considering how long that they were calling out, that they had to land somewhere and were waiting to be rescued, but obviously that rescue never came. And who's to say some of them didn't wait decades for rescue that would never come? And I'm not one for making conspiracy theories or anything, but why have the local authorities flat out refused to ever look for the plane? That's weird. That makes this almost sound like there's a cover-up happening. And that just makes it one of these weird, strange mysteries from World War II that'll likely never be solved unless a private search happens to find the plane. Watch, it's going to be sitting on an island somewhere and has been all this time. Who knows? But for whatever reason, the plane disappeared, called out for days, stating everyone was waiting to be picked up as if it had landed somewhere, went radio silent, and to this day the authorities refuse to investigate why. So draw your own conclusions from that, and let's move on to the next one. Our next entry involved a plane crashing into the sea with no apparent cause. Yes, Spino, I know, planes don't do that for no reason, but the reason is the mystery. Flight 240 was a regular service aircraft taking people from Hungary to Lebanon. In 1975, during what should have just been any other normal flight, the plane was coming in for its regular landing procedures when suddenly it didn't land. Instead, it crashed into the Mediterranean Sea, just off Lebanon's coast. All 60 people on board were killed, and no statement into the crash was ever made publicly. A report on the crash was rumored to have been written later in 2003, but it was ordered to remain top secret for reasons unconnected to the crash. Again, not one to make conspiracy theories, but that is also weird. That's very weird. Why are they being so secretive about this plane that crashed just off the coast? Who or what was on that plane that warrants such a response? According to a Hungarian TV station in a documentary that aired in 2008, there was allegedly documentation of a search and rescue mission that recovered 15 bodies. But again, no public statements were ever made, and all the documents regarding this case are sealed. Now, one reason for this comes from an unidentified witness to the event who said the plane did not crash, but it was shot down. British military pilots and radar operators all claimed this too, so again, I'm just going to let you make your own conclusions on this one, but if you ask me, there's something going on here, and someone somewhere wants to keep something hidden. The only question is who, and what are they hiding? Alright, now we're getting into some really, really obscure ones that don't have hardly any information about them, so we're going to start flying through these pretty quick. We're going way back in time for this one. Not to the Cretaceous again, or even ancient Egypt, but instead, the 3rd century of the AH dating calendar, which is actually a different dating system than the common calendar, AD or CE. With those, the date would actually be 834. Still a long time ago, though. Now, I'm going to try to pronounce this guy's name, but in case I get it wrong, I'm going to put it on screen. Muhammad ibn al-Qasim was an individual with not much surviving information about him. We don't even know his date of birth beyond it being in the 3rd century AH. And he ends up vanishing from history as a fugitive on the run, but I would say it's safe to assume he's probably dead by now. Muhammad led a rebellion in the early 3rd century, and he was defeated in this rebellion and promptly arrested. So, good job, dude. He was detained in the palace of the ruler he had rebelled against in Baghdad, but Muhammad escaped, fled, and was never seen again. He vanishes from all historical records, and what his fate was is completely unknown. And that is literally all the information about him that survives. A very obscure historical mystery indeed. Wonder what happened to him after he went on the run. We're going back just under another century further than the last one to 753 CE to talk about, and please don't burn me at the stake if I mispronounce this name, I really tried to learn how to pronounce it, Vijayaditya II, and the fact that he just disappears from history randomly. He was the crown prince of an ancient classical dynasty in India and was born in 738 AD, and he was the crown prince of the dynasty until its destruction and fall. Before then, though, Vijayaditya had grown up in a time when his father was plagued with intense outside pressure, including from the Rashtrakutas in the north. In 753, they would be the ones to destroy the dynasty. So this is obviously going to be a very summarized version of what is a lot of very complex history, and I'm just going to get straight to the mystery part of this whole story. When the Rashtrakuta army reached the capital of the dynasty in 753 AD, Vijayaditya II and his wife escaped the fall of the city by fleeing to the Ganga territory, which is where his wife was actually from. She was a princess from that kingdom. For years they lived there until in 774 AD, Vijayaditya left for a journey to the north, and he just disappears. Yep, Spino, he just disappears from recorded history and is never heard from again. This is probably only a mystery because the records of what happened to him after this point have just been lost. He was an important figure for his time, so there's no way that just nothing was ever written down. But because of the fact that this historical figure does just abruptly vanish, and whatever his fate was is now an unsolved mystery, it fits perfectly into this video. But since we know he had descendants some 220 years later, he clearly didn't die on whatever this journey to the north was, and he lived a full life. The records are just lost, leaving us with a mystery that really shouldn't be a mystery, but is because a piece of the story is missing. So we're just left with a weird case of an incomplete story for this one that will likely never be solved. I also hope that I didn't terribly mispronounce any of these recent names. If I did, please feel free to correct me in the comments. I'd love to learn how they're meant to be said. These last two were just really hard to find information on in English, and there's not much in English about them, so even hearing the names said correctly was not an easy task. Thankfully, I'm in my element for the next one. Alright, those last two were hard to find information on in English. Thankfully, this next one, however, was not. And while there is still not a whole lot of noteworthy information to cover, this one was one of my favorites of the video. A good old maritime mystery for the last one of the video. Y'all always seem to love these, so let's have another one. And, fittingly, a very obscure one. The City of London was a passenger steamship that belonged to the Inman Line. And if you've been around for a while, we've covered a few ships from this line before. They didn't have the best track record, with both the City of Boston and the City of Glasgow disappearing, both of which were also Inman Line ships. And these aren't their only ones to go missing, either. The City of London herself existed in that, what I've called the hybrid phase of steamships when they were being transitioned from sail to steam power. She was built in 1863 by Todd and McGregor. She was a striking ship with 3 masts and a single funnel jutting up out of her deck. She weighed 2,801 gross registered tons, had a compound engine, a single shaft, and one screw. Her career was not particularly eventful, and it was smooth sailing for her for nearly 20 years. Then, in November of 1881, she departed New York for London and was never seen again. There is absolutely no clue as to what happened to her, and no wreck or wreckage has ever been found. But it rests somewhere on the bottom of the ocean, undiscovered to this day. No theories really exist either, but it's possible that she might have struck an iceberg given the time of year and the area of the ocean she was in when she vanished. But storms, rogue waves, fire are all also possibilities. Either way, no matter what caused it, the ship disappeared and was presumed sunk, and all 41 people who were on board were never seen again and all lost at sea with their ship. The only way we could ever learn any clues about the loss would be if the wreck, or whatever is left of it, is found, because it still might bear the clues of what happened to her. All right, a fun bonus topic real quick at the end before we end off the video. Something lighthearted for once in this video and not stories of people going missing, planes crashing, and people being murdered and never being solved. This one was also a last-minute addition to the script, but it was too weird not to talk about. Plus, as I said, we've talked about murders, mayhem, and disappearances and great tragedies for way too long now, so let's end on a lighthearted but no less bizarre note. So there was this Coke-themed vending machine on Capitol Hill in Seattle that operated from the early 1990s until 2018. Now, what's weird about that? Well, the machine abruptly vanished, but that's not all. Who stocked the machine for that entire time is unknown, which, okay, that doesn't make any sense. How are there no cameras? How did no one ever see anybody? No one has any idea who stocked this machine for all those years, but it responded to things as they happened. When Seattle passed a sugary drink tax, the cost for drinks on the machine likewise increased. And then 5 months later, it just abruptly vanished. Yeah, I know, it's weird. Also, the mystery drinks on the machine, dispersed, were rare cans. The kind that are ordinarily unavailable, and the drinks themselves consisted of ones you don't typically get in vending machines, such as Mountain Dew Whiteout, raspberry flavored brisk, Hawaiian punch. I almost said Halloween punch. Next Halloween movie, Halloween Ends, Halloween punch. The drinks consisted of Mountain Dew Whiteout, raspberry flavored brisk, Hawaiian punch, grape Fanta, and there are claims things like vanilla Coke and Sunkist cherry limeade were also drinks that you could get from the machine. But what else is weird about this machine is that you never knew what you were going to get. They were all mysteries. As you can see on screen, the button simply said mystery when you made your selection. And when the machine disappeared, a Facebook message went up saying, "Going for a walk, need to find myself, maybe take a shower even." The machine reappeared in October 2022, but vanished again that December and has never been seen again. And it's just this weird, bizarre story, and to this day, no one knows who stocks or moves the machine around. It's definitely not a licensed machine either, and I bet there are conspiracy theories about this one if you look it up, but I do not have the energy or the will to look any of them up myself. So I'll let you go down whatever rabbit hole exists about this machine, because I know there has to be one somewhere. And with that, that was a collection of 11 more very obscure historical mysteries, and even prehistoric mysteries in some cases. I really hope you enjoyed it, because this was a really big video to end off the month, and it took a lot of time to put together. If you did, it would mean the world if you liked and subscribed. That not only helps me grow, but lets me know that this is the kind of content you like and you want to see more of it. And I do hope you stay tuned for what I have coming next. I have more mysteries and prehistory videos planned for December. And also check out volumes 1 and 2 of this series for even more really obscure unsolved mysteries if you enjoyed this one. In those, we cover such lovely things such as the murder of Agrippina the Younger, the Kentucky meat shower, the lifeboat of Bouvet Island, the L8 blimp, the miracle of the sun, all kinds of weird things that happened in history that are pretty unknown. So check them out. And with all that said, have a good one, everyone. Thank you for watching.